Welcome to a journey through one of the most turbulent and dramatic eras in ancient history. The book of 2 Kings is not just a record of dates and names, it is a cinematic epic of a kingdom standing at a crossroads between greatness and ruin. As we open this chapter, the golden age of Solomon is a fading memory, and the nation is fractured into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This is a story of fire-breathing prophets and iron-fisted conquerors, of miraculous healings and tragic downfalls. It is a world where the supernatural breaches the physical, where chariots of fire roam the hills, and where the decisions of a single king can determine the destiny of an entire people. Through the rise and fall of dynasties, we will witness the relentless struggle between faith and power, and the ultimate consequence of a nation losing its soul. Prepare to witness the final days of the divided kingdom. This is the epic saga of 2 Kings. The air in the hills of Samaria was thick with the scent of impending change, a heavy stillness that precedes a great storm. King Ahaziah, the son of the infamous Ahab, lay broken in his upper chamber. A careless fall through the lattice of his palace had left him fragile, his life leaking away like water from a cracked cistern. But instead of turning to the God of his ancestors, the God who had delivered Israel from the furnace of Egypt, Ahaziah reached out into the darkness. He sent messengers to Ekron, to the temple of Baal-zebub, the Lord of the Flies, seeking a word of hope from a silent idol. High on the slopes of the mountains, a man of different metal stood, Elijah the Tishbite, clothed in animal skins and girded with leather, received a word that burned like fire in his bones. The angel of the Lord spoke, and the prophet moved. As Ahaziah's messengers hurried toward the coast, a solitary figure blocked their path. His eyes were like embers, and his voice was the crack of thunder. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you go to inquire of Baal-zebub?" he demanded. The decree was swift. The king would not leave the bed he lay upon. He would surely die. When the messengers returned with this grim prophecy, Ahaziah's heart hardened. He sent a captain with 50 men to seize the prophet. Imagine the scene for your video. A company of iron-clad soldiers climbing the rocky terrain, their armor glinting in the harsh sun, finding the man of God sitting calmly on the crest of a hill. "Man of God," the captain shouted with the arrogance of earthly power. "The king says, 'Come down.'" Elijah's response was not one of fear, but of authority. "If I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. In an instant, the sky tore open. A pillar of white-hot, celestial flame descended, and where 50 soldiers stood, only ash and silence remained. A second captain and 50 more men met the same fiery fate. It was only when the third captain fell on his knees, pleading for the lives of his men, that the fire stayed its hand. Elijah descended, not as a captive, but as a judge, walking into the lion's den of the palace to deliver the final word to the king's face. Ahaziah died, just as the word of the Lord had spoken, and the throne passed to his brother Joram. But a greater transition was unfolding. The time had come for Elijah to be taken up, and his loyal disciple, Elisha, knew it in his spirit. They began a journey that traced the sacred geography of their faith, from Gilgal to Bethel, from Bethel to Jericho. At every stop, Elijah tested Elisha's resolve, urging him to stay behind. But Elisha's loyalty was ironclad. "As the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, I will not leave you," he vowed. 50 sons of the prophets watched from a distance, sensing the electricity in the air, the vibration of a world about to be breached by the supernatural. They reached the banks of the Jordan River. The water was a barrier, deep and swirling. Elijah took his mantle, the symbol of his prophetic office, wrapped it together, and struck the waters. Just as the Red Sea had once bowed to Moses, the Jordan parted. The two men walked across on dry ground, leaving the world of men behind. "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you," Elijah said. Elisha did not ask for wealth or long life. He asked for the hardest thing: "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." It was a request for the birthright of the firstborn, the spiritual inheritance to lead. Elijah replied, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you." As they continued to walk and talk, the atmosphere shifted. The wind began to howl, and a vortex of light descended from the heavens. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, cutting a path between the two men. It was a spectacle beyond human comprehension, a celestial vehicle of war and glory. Elijah was swept up in the whirlwind. Elisha watched, his eyes wide with awe and grief, crying out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." The sky closed. The silence returned. Elijah was gone, but his mantle lay on the ground. Elisha picked it up, the heavy, rough garment that carried the weight of a nation's soul. He returned to the Jordan and struck the water with the mantle. "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" he cried. The waters parted for him, just as they had for his master. The transition was complete. A new era of miracles had begun. Elisha's first days were marked by both restoration and judgment. In Jericho, he healed the bitter waters with a jar of salt, bringing life to a barren land. But as he journeyed toward Bethel, a group of youths came out to mock him, disrespecting the office of the prophet. The judgment was swift and terrifying as two bears emerged from the woods, a grim reminder that the power Elisha now wielded was not to be trifled with. The stage was set. The fire of Elijah now burned in Elisha, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah would soon learn that though kings may fall and empires may rise, the word of the Lord remains the only true anchor in the storm of history. The mantle of Elijah now rested upon the shoulders of Elisha, and with it came a double portion of the Spirit that had once challenged kings and called down fire. But where Elijah was a man of the wilderness and the lightning bolt, Elisha was a man of the people, a prophet who walked through the city gates, stood in the palaces of kings, and sat in the humble homes of widows. His ministry was a tapestry of wonder, woven with threads of deep compassion and terrifying authority. The horizon of Israel was soon clouded by the dust of marching armies. 3 kings, the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom, had joined forces to suppress a rebellion by the Moabites. But their ambition outpaced their wisdom. 7 days into their march through the scorched wilderness of Edom, the water ran dry, men gasped for air in the heat, and the horses stumbled in the parched sand. Panic gripped the camp. The king of Israel cried out in despair, fearing the Lord had lured them into the desert only to hand them over to Moab. But Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, looked for a higher counsel. "Is there no prophet of the Lord here?" he asked. They found Elisha. At first, the prophet's words were sharp, stinging the king of Israel for his family's history of idolatry. Yet, for the sake of the faithful Jehoshaphat, Elisha called for a harpist. As the music drifted through the dry air, the hand of the Lord came upon him. He gave a command that seemed nonsensical to the thirsty soldiers. "Make this valley full of trenches." He promised that though they would see no wind and see no rain, the valley would be filled with water. By morning, as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a miraculous flood rushed from the direction of Edom. To the Moabites looking on from afar, the sun reflecting off the water made it look like pools of blood. Thinking the 3 kings had slaughtered one another, the Moabites rushed in blindly, only to be met by a revitalized and waiting army. The desert had become a place of deliverance, but Elisha's power was not reserved only for the geopolitical theater. It reached into the quiet, desperate corners of everyday life. Imagine a small, dimly lit room where a widow weeps. Her husband, a servant of God, is dead, and the creditors are at the door, threatening to take her 2 sons as slaves to pay her debts. She had nothing left but a tiny jar of oil. Elisha did not give her gold. He gave her a mission of faith. "Go, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not gather just a few." Picture the scene for your video. The sons running through the streets, returning with every pot, jar, and basin they could find. In the privacy of her home, with the door shut, the widow began to pour. From that one small jar, a golden stream of oil flowed. It filled the first pot, then the second, then the third. The oil did not stop until every borrowed vessel was brimming. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt," Elisha told her, "and you and your sons live on the rest." It was a miracle of abundance in the face of absolute lack. Elisha's path then led him to Shunem, where a wealthy woman recognized his holiness and built him a small roof chamber. In gratitude, Elisha prophesied that she would have a son, despite her husband's old age. The child was born, a miracle of joy. But years later, tragedy struck. The boy cried out in the harvest field, my head, and by noon he lay dead on his mother's lap. Without a word of despair, she laid him on the prophet's bed and rode with fury to find Elisha. When Elisha arrived, he went into the room alone and shut the door. He stretched himself out over the cold body of the child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. The flesh of the child grew warm. Elisha paced the room, then stretched himself out again. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. The prophet handed the living son back to his mother, a silent testament that the God of Israel held the keys to the grave itself. The fame of Elisha spread even beyond the borders of Israel, reaching the ears of the mighty Syrian Empire. Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, was a man of great valor and prestige, but he carried a shadow. He was a leper. His skin was a map of decay beneath his shining armor. Following the word of a young captive Israeli girl, Naaman traveled to Israel with horses, chariots, and a fortune in silver and gold, expecting a grand reception and a dramatic ritual. But Elisha did not even come out to meet him. He simply sent a messenger with a humiliating instruction: go and wash in the Jordan 7 times. Naaman was livid. Were not the rivers of Damascus, the Abana and the Pharpar, better than all the waters of Israel? He turned away in a rage, but his servants urged him to try. Visualize the proud general, stripping away his royal robes and his heavy armor, revealing the white, scaly patches of his disease. He stepped into the muddy, swirling waters of the Jordan. Once, twice, 6 times he dipped, and nothing changed. But on the 7th time, as he rose from the water, his flesh was restored like that of a little child. He was clean, not just in body, but in spirit. He returned to Elisha, declaring that there was no God in all the earth but in Israel. Yet, where there is grace, there is also judgment. Elisha's servant, Gehazi, blinded by greed, chased after Naaman to take the gifts Elisha had refused. He lied to the prophet upon his return, but Elisha's spirit had been with him in the shadows. "Did not my heart go with you?" Elisha asked. As Gehazi left the room, the leprosy that had left Naaman clung to him like a curse, white as snow. The shadows of war soon returned. The king of Aram was frustrated. Every time he planned a secret ambush against Israel, Elisha warned the king of Israel. Realizing the prophet was the true threat, the Aramean king sent a massive army by night to surround the city of Dothan. When Elisha's servant woke the next morning and looked over the walls, he saw a sea of iron and horses encircling them. "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" he cried. Elisha's response is one of the most powerful moments in the book. "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed, "Lord, open his eyes that he may see." Suddenly, the veil between the physical and spiritual realms was torn away. For your video, imagine the hills surrounding the Aramean army suddenly erupting in celestial fire. The mountains were filled with horses and chariots of fire, an angelic host outnumbering the mortal enemy. Elisha struck the Arameans with blindness and led them, like a line of helpless children, right into the heart of the capital city, Samaria. But instead of slaughtering them, he fed them and sent them home, overcoming evil with a terrifyingly powerful kindness. But Samaria's peace was short-lived. A later siege by the Arameans brought the city to the brink of horrific famine. The situation was so dire that mothers were bargaining over the lives of their children for food. The king of Israel blamed Elisha and sought his head. But Elisha stood firm, prophesying that by this time tomorrow, fine flour and barley would be sold for a pittance at the gate of Samaria. It seemed impossible. At the edge of the city, 4 lepers sat in the dust. They reasoned that if they stayed, they would die of hunger. If they went to the Aramean camp, they might be killed, but they might also find food. As they approached the camp at twilight, the Lord caused the Arameans to hear the sound of a great army, the thundering of chariots, and the neighing of thousands of horses. Panicked, the entire Aramean army fled, leaving behind their tents, their horses, their gold, and their vast stores of food. The 4 lepers entered the silent camp. They ate and drank, and then, realizing they could not keep this news to themselves, they ran back to the city. The gates were opened, and the starving people of Samaria rushed out to feast on the abundance left behind. The word of the Lord was fulfilled. The famine was broken in a single night. The years passed, and the time came for Elisha to face the end of his long journey. As he lay on his deathbed, King Jehoash of Israel came to him, weeping. Even though the king was not a godly man, he recognized that Elisha was the true chariots and horsemen of Israel. Elisha, even in his weakness, had one final prophetic act. He told the king to strike the ground with arrows. The king struck 3 times and stopped. Elisha was angry, for if the king had struck 5 or 6 times, he would have completely destroyed his enemies. Elisha died and was buried, but his story did not end with his breath. Sometime later, during a raid, a group of Israelites were burying a man and, in their haste, threw the body into Elisha's tomb. As soon as the dead man's body touched the bones of Elisha, the man revived and stood on his feet. Even in death, the power of the life that had flowed through Elisha was so potent that it could jump-start a heart. The era of Elisha was a season of wonders, a time when the heavens were open and the mercy of God was tangible. But as the echoes of his miracles faded, the dark clouds of idolatry and political corruption began to gather once more over the divided kingdoms, leading them toward a destiny of fire and exile. The golden era of the prophets had passed, and a cold, relentless wind began to blow from the north. If the time of Elisha was marked by the light of miracles, the era that followed was defined by the encroaching shadows of empire and the slow, agonizing rot of a nation that had forgotten its soul. We now enter the 3rd act of this epic, a period of deceptive prosperity followed by a rapid, violent descent into the abyss. Imagine a map of the ancient world. In the center lies Israel, fractured and bleeding. To the north and east, a monster was waking up, the Assyrian Empire. Their war machine was unlike anything the world had ever seen, engineered for cruelty, built for conquest, and destined to be the rod of judgment for a people who had turned their backs on the light. The story shifts first to the northern kingdom under Jeroboam II. On the surface, it looked like a rebirth. For 41 years, Jeroboam II restored the borders of Israel, bringing back wealth and territory not seen since the days of Solomon. The markets were full, the palaces were ivory-clad, and the people felt secure. But this was a hollow shell. Behind the silk curtains and the overflowing wine vats, the heart of the nation was dead. They worshipped at the golden calves of Bethel and Dan. They trampled the poor. They ignored the warnings of the prophets Amos and Hosea, who cried out in the streets that the end was near. When Jeroboam II died, the dam finally broke. What followed was a Game of Thrones in its most brutal form. Imagine the cinematic chaos. King Zechariah is murdered in public by Shallum after only 6 months. Shallum reigns for a mere 30 days before he is butchered by Menahem. Menahem, a man of terrifying cruelty, ripped open the pregnant women of the cities that resisted him. To stay in power, he stripped the wealthy of Israel of their silver to pay off the Assyrian king Pul, essentially turning his own nation into a slave state to buy a few more years of hollow peace. While Israel crumbled into civil war and assassination, the southern kingdom of Judah watched with trembling eyes. They had their own struggles. King Azariah, also known as Josiah, was a powerful ruler who did what was right, yet he failed to remove the high places where the people burned incense to false gods. In his pride, he tried to take over the duties of the priests, and the Bible tells us that leprosy broke out on his forehead right in the temple. He ended his days in a separate house, a king in isolation, while his son Jotham managed the affairs of the state. But the real darkness in Judah arrived with King Ahaz. Imagine a king so desperate and so spiritually bankrupt that he sacrificed his own son in the fire of the pagan god Molech. When threatened by a coalition of Israel and Syria, Ahaz didn't turn to the God of David. Instead, he sent a message to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser, saying, "I am your servant and your son." He stripped the gold from the temple of the Lord to pay the Assyrian butcher. Even worse, he went to Damascus, saw a pagan altar there, and sent the blueprint back to Jerusalem, ordering the high priest to replace the bronze altar of the Lord with this foreign design. The heart of Judah's worship was being hollowed out from the inside. Back in the north, the clock had finally run out for Israel. The final king, Hoshea, tried to play a dangerous game of international politics. He stopped paying tribute to Assyria and secretly reached out to Egypt for an alliance. It was a fatal mistake. Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, discovered the treachery. He marched his iron-clad legions south, sweeping through the Galilean hills like a swarm of locusts. The siege of Samaria began. For 3 long, agonizing years, the capital city of the northern kingdom held out. Picture the city on the hill, surrounded by a sea of Assyrian tents. Inside, there was starvation and despair. Outside, the sound of battering rams and the screams of the conquerors. In 722 BC, the walls finally crumbled. This was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual catastrophe. The Bible pauses here, the narrator's voice heavy with grief, to explain why this happened. The people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. They had built high places in all their towns. They had set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. They had ignored the prophets who pleaded with them to turn from your evil ways. They had become stiff-necked, just like their ancestors. They had sold themselves to do evil. The Assyrian policy was one of calculated frightfulness. They didn't just conquer, they erased. They uprooted the people of Israel, the 10 tribes, and carried them away into exile, scattering them across the vast reaches of Upper Mesopotamia and Media. These are the lost tribes of Israel, people who vanished into the mists of history, their identity swallowed by the empire. To ensure the land stayed productive, the king of Assyria brought in foreigners from Babylon, Cutha, and other conquered lands to settle in the ruins of Samaria. But the land itself seemed to rebel. The Bible tells of lions that began to roam the countryside, killing the new settlers. The people believed it was because they didn't know the law of the God of the land. So, the Assyrians sent back one of the exiled priests of Israel to teach them. The result was a strange, hybrid religion. These new inhabitants, who would become known as the Samaritans, feared the Lord, but also continued to serve their own idols. They lived in a spiritual twilight, a mixture of the holy and the profane. The northern kingdom was gone. The 10 tribes were in chains. The hills of Ephraim were silent, the vineyards tended by strangers. All that remained of the promise made to Abraham and David was the tiny, flickering lamp of the southern kingdom of Judah. And even that lamp was sputtering in the wind, surrounded by the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The scene was set for the final act. Would Judah learn from the charred ruins of their brothers to the north, or would they follow them into the long night of exile? The northern kingdom of Israel was now a ghost, a memory fading into the mist of the Assyrian plains. The stage was narrow, the spotlight focused solely on the tiny kingdom of Judah. It stood like a lone lighthouse in a sea of rising empires, flickering against the darkness of the surrounding world. This final act is a story of 2 great peaks of light and a final, crushing descent into the shadows of Babylon. The first peak of light came with King Hezekiah. Imagine a scene of restoration. The doors of the temple, long neglected and tarnished, are swung open once more. Hezekiah was a man who walked with the shadow of David. He did not just manage the state, he fought for its soul. He tore down the high places, smashed the sacred pillars, and in a bold act of iconoclasm broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, because the people had turned it into an idol. But faith is often tested by fire. The Assyrian monster, having swallowed Samaria, now turned its hungry eyes toward Jerusalem. King Sennacherib sent his supreme commander to the walls of the city. Visualize the scene for your video. A vast iron-clad army encircling the city, their banners snapping in the wind. The commander stood below the walls and shouted in Hebrew, mocking Hezekiah and, more importantly, mocking God. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cried to the terrified people on the walls, has any god of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Hezekiah did not respond with a sword, but with a prayer. He went into the temple and spread the enemy's threatening letter before the Lord. Now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. That night, the silence over the Assyrian camp was not the silence of sleep, but the silence of the grave. The Bible tells us that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 men in the camp. When the sun rose, the pride of Assyria was a field of corpses. Sennacherib retreated in shame, eventually meeting his end at the hands of his own sons. Yet, even Hezekiah was human. When he fell terminally ill, he wept and prayed, and God granted him 15 more years, a miracle confirmed by the shadow of the sun moving backward on the stairway. But in those extra years, a moment of pride sowed the seeds of future ruin. He showed the visiting envoys from Babylon all the treasures of his house. The prophet Isaiah told him the bitter truth: everything in your house will be carried off to Babylon. Then came the longest and darkest night in Judah's history, the reign of Manasseh. If Hezekiah was the light, his son Manasseh was the eclipse. For 55 years, he systematically undid every good thing his father had done. He built altars for the host of heaven inside the temple of the Lord. He practiced sorcery and consulted mediums. Most horrifyingly, he sacrificed his own children in the fire. The Bible records that Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. It was during this reign that the spiritual point of no return was reached. The Lord declared that because of the sins of Manasseh, the destruction of Jerusalem was now inevitable. But there was one last flicker of glory before the end. It came in the form of a boy king named Josiah. At 8 years old, he took the throne, and at 18, he began a renovation of the temple. During the work, the high priest found a dusty, forgotten scroll, the Book of the Law. When it was read to the young king, he did not just listen, he collapsed. He tore his clothes in grief, realizing how far his nation had fallen from the path. Josiah's reform was a whirlwind. Imagine the cinematic energy of this segment. The king himself standing by the pillar in the temple, renewing the covenant before all the people. He purged the land with a holy fury. He burned the idols, ground them to powder, and defiled the pagan altars. He even went north to Bethel and destroyed the altar Jeroboam had built centuries before, fulfilling a prophecy made hundreds of years earlier. He celebrated a Passover so grand and so pure that nothing like it had been seen since the days of the judges. But even the goodness of Josiah could not stop the clock. He died in a tragic battle against Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at Megiddo, and with him, the last hope of Judah died too. The final chapters of the book read like a frantic countdown. The crown of Judah became a plaything for the new superpower, Babylon. Josiah's sons, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah, were weak men caught between the gears of history. They rebelled, they conspired, and they failed. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, finally lost his patience. In 586 BC, his armies surrounded Jerusalem for the last time. This is the climax of your video. The once proud city of David, starving, broken, and desperate. The walls were breached. King Zedekiah tried to flee in the dark of night, but he was captured. His sons were slaughtered before his eyes, and then his eyes were put out. The last thing he ever saw was the death of his lineage. Then came the fire. the commander of the Babylonian guard set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. The massive bronze pillars that Solomon had built were broken into pieces and carried away as scrap metal. The walls of the city were leveled to the ground. The people, the craftsmen, the warriors, the priests were marched in chains across the desert to Babylon. The land was left desolate, inhabited only by the poorest of the poor to tend the vineyards. The book of 2 Kings ends on a strange, haunting note. Years into the exile, the captive King Jehoiachin was released from prison by the new king of Babylon. He was given a seat of honor and allowed to eat at the king's table for the rest of his life. It is a small, quiet ending to a story of fire and blood. It is a whisper of hope in the midst of judgment, a reminder that while the temple was gone and the land was lost, the line of David had not been completely extinguished. The light was dim, almost invisible, but it was not yet out. The story of the kings had ended, but the story of the promise was waiting for a new chapter to begin. As the smoke clears over the ruins of Jerusalem and the echoes of the Babylonian chains fade into the distance, we reach the end of this profound journey. Looking back at the pages of 2 Kings, I see a story that is deeply human. It serves as a mirror to our own world, a reminder that prosperity is fragile and that the true strength of a nation lies not in its walls or its wealth, but in its character and its commitment to truth. Even in the darkest moments of the exile, the book leaves us with a tiny spark of hope, a sign that while kingdoms may crumble, the promises of God are never fully extinguished. It is a sobering yet powerful testament to the resilience of hope amidst the ashes of failure. Thank you so much for joining me in exploring this incredible piece of history and faith. If you found this journey through 2 Kings insightful, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating high-quality content that brings the ancient wisdom of the Bible to life in English. Don't forget to hit the like button and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we continue to uncover the most beautiful and powerful stories of the Bible together. Until next time, keep seeking the light.